Hey everyone, welcome. So many of us are familiar with the stories in the Gospel of Mark, right? The healings, the parables, all of that. But today we're going to go a layer deeper. We're going to explore the story behind the story. Think of it like a historical mystery, and we're about to start gathering the clues.
I mean, you've probably heard these stories your whole life, in mass, in school, but the real puzzle isn't just what Jesus said or did. The real question is, who wrote all of this down? And maybe even more importantly, why? It's kind of like a detective case, and we're going to follow the evidence together.
So, our investigation kicks off with a really surprising first clue. The Gospel of Mark, just like Matthew, Luke, and John. Well, it was originally written anonymously.
That's the central question, isn't it? If the author never actually signed his name, how in the world did we end up with the title, The Gospel According to Mark? Well, to figure that out, we have to look at the clues left behind, both in the historical record and, baked right into the text itself.
To solve this mystery, we really need to build a profile of our author. And when you look at the evidence, two main theories bubble up to the surface. One comes from the tradition of the early church, and the other is what most modern biblical scholars lean towards.
So on one hand, you have the traditional view which the church has held for centuries. It identifies the author as John Mark, a guy we know as a companion to both St. Paul and, this is the important part, St. Peter. Then you have the modern scholarly view. It suggests the author was an unknown but very skilled Hellenistic, meaning culturally Greek, Jewish Christian who was weaving together all these oral traditions for a community that desperately needed them.
Okay, now this is our earliest external clue, and it's a big one. It comes from an early church father named Papias, writing around AD 135. He's the first person we know of who connects this specific gospel to Mark, and he calls him Peter's interpreter. Now you have to understand, this link was absolutely vital. In an age where tons of stories about Jesus were flying around, tying this account directly to an eyewitness apostle like Peter, well, that gave it indisputable authority. It was the gold standard.
So what if we don't actually have to choose between these two views? The most compelling profile of our author comes together when we combine the clues. The author was almost certainly a figure exactly like John Mark, someone who was just perfectly positioned to be a kind of narrative bridge. He could connect the rock-solid eyewitness testimony of apostles like Peter to the urgent, real-world needs of a brand-new generation of believers, many of whom were not Jewish.
All right, so we've got a pretty good profile of the who. Now let's get into the why. You see, this gospel wasn't written in some quiet, peaceful library. No way. It was forged in a moment of intense crisis. It was a true trial by fire for that early Christian community.
This timeline really helps us zero in on that critical moment. See that date, AD 70? That's when the Roman army marched into Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. For Jewish people and the early Jewish Christians, this wasn't just a military defeat. It was a theological catastrophe. The center of their universe had just been wiped off the map. Mark is writing right in the shadow of this exact event, for a community that is just reeling from the trauma.
And you can just feel the intense pressure his community was under. First, they lived under the constant threat of Roman persecution. Second, they were grappling with this massive spiritual crisis. If God's temple can be destroyed, what does that mean? And third, because of all this, they urgently needed a story to guide them. A narrative that could show them how to stay faithful through suffering, just like Jesus did.
Okay, so we know who the author probably was and why he was writing. But here's the next question. For whom? The text itself is just filled with what you might call forensic evidence, little clues that point directly to a non-Jewish or Gentile audience.
It's actually brilliant when you see the strategies the author uses. First, he keeps pausing the story to explain Jewish customs that an outsider just wouldn't get. Second, whenever Jesus speaks a word in Aramaic, Mark immediately translates it into Greek for his audience. And third, as we're about to see, he built his entire story to a climax that centers on, you guessed it, a Gentile. He is systematically taking down any cultural barriers that might get in the way of the story.
And this right here, this is the mic drop moment of the entire gospel. It drives the whole point home. Who is the very first human being in the entire story to finally, fully recognize who Jesus is? It's not Peter. It's not any of the disciples. It's a Roman centurion, a total outsider, a Gentile, standing there at the foot of the cross. This is the author's giant flashing sign that this message is for the whole world.
So let's put all the pieces together now. We have the author, who's a bridge between the Jewish apostles and a growing Gentile world. We have the context, a community in absolute crisis. We have the audience,
outsiders who are being invited in. It all points to the gospel's ultimate two-part purpose.
When you boil it all down, Mark's gospel did two incredibly powerful things at once. For its original audience, it was a practical, hands-on survival guide, a manual for how to get through a crisis with your faith intact. But in doing that, in serving that very specific need, it became something absolutely timeless, a universal invitation for anyone, anywhere, at any time to encounter the story of Jesus.
And that leaves us with a final thought to chew on. Understanding the urgency, the danger, and the raw hope that was baked into the very origins of this gospel, well, that's not just some academic exercise. It really changes how you read it, doesn't it? It makes us ask, what are the crises in our own world, in our own lives? And how does Mark's urgent message of faithful endurance speak directly to us, right here, today?